Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks, Brim. Lovely. I'm Ian Brown. I am eco-builder, carpenter, project manager. I work for a firm called Hartley Quinn Wilson. We're based just outside in Lewes. Interestingly, how I introduced myself there, just because I was always an eco-builder first, and I've kind of come back through, in some respects, trying to work my way through standard construction and kind of turn them green as I go. So the principles I'm going to talk to you about today and the things we're going to talk through are deep inside my core being as I work. And people who know me know that I love straw bale building. It's what I do. And wherever I can, I try and encourage straw bale buildings, and hopefully one day I'll see a straw bale building on every street corner, as it were. So this afternoon I'm going to talk to you about sourcing natural materials, building with natural materials and living with them. Hopefully this morning you've obviously heard a bit about some of these concepts and maybe living with them as well. I'm going to come from a builder's perspective, so it's slightly different in that sense. So I'll start off with the principle essentially of working at home. So the most important thing in terms of a connection of what we have with the environment around us. Now, it would be ignorant to think that we are not connected with the landscapes that we exist in. And I could go so far as to push that to the buildscapes as well. The buildscapes around us, the environment that we live our lives in, the day-to-day, is having a huge impact on us. And these have been documented, the mental health issues, physical well-beings, the implications of living in bad environments are well documented. But we could go further than that to say that the senses that we have on our body are constantly being surrounded by our environments that we build. So to introduce synthetic materials into those environments kind of doesn't really go with what we are as to be human. It goes against that. It puts a barrier and stops us from being able to experience landscapes better and experience of who we are in many respects. So to identify the synthetic materials around us and to try and replace them with natural materials, or even revert back to them as we traditionally would have done many years ago, is really what I want to see and what I want to move forward with. So a little question in here. I mean, it's dark, it's pretty unfair on you really, but I'm going to ask you to have a look around you now and look at the materials that you have in this structure around you, and whether anybody can actually identify a natural material that hasn't been produced or manufactured or finished with synthetic materials or synthetic, maybe petrochemically sourced material. So anything in this room at all, I don't think there is anything. And in fact, I was go so bold as to give you the contents of my wallet, which is obviously a trade card and £5 cash. Obviously, construction doesn't pay very well nowadays. And a key to something which I just don't know where it goes to, so there's a random key. And a £5 note, which is on the table for anybody that actually can name a material in this room that is solely natural. Go on. Me? Well, that's an interesting one. The products I put on my hair, obviously, to make it all fluffy. No. The clothes we wear, the things we eat, there's no way, shape or form you could argue that a human is a natural thing nowadays, unfortunately. So, the wooden stage, yep, so it's been painted, and I would hope and would like to think that maybe it's been painted with natural paint of some sort, but I very much doubt it. Even if it wasn't, then maybe the transportation and the extraction of those materials to make that deck, that's a man-made sheeting material. And unfortunately, it is the environments that we live in now, is that they are man-made and synthetic in a great deal. So, yeah, I did a talk very similar to this about 15 years ago to the Welsh Assembly Government at a centre called Techniquest in Cardiff. And I ran this seminar 3 days back to back, and on the very last day I opened the questioning out to, can you find anything in this room that is actually natural, as opposed to just the built environment, but actually anything at all. And I ended up losing my money to a 6-year-old boy who brought in a pine cone that he'd had from his garden, that he'd walked here with as well, just by happen chance. So yeah, I don't do that one anymore. But yeah, it is kind of a bit alarming to think that actually even the natural materials, or what we even consider to be natural, have got some kind of synthetic coating or some synthetic glues or coatings from petrochemical sources. So it is alarming, and we do know that our indoor environments are very well polluted, and probably worse polluted than our outdoor environments in many places. So natural materials on the whole, do we still use them? Well, we do. And surprisingly enough, these natural materials listed here are some of the heaviest used materials in the UK, the highest demand. So much so that the government keeps track of their prices very closely and monitors the construction industry to some degree by how well and how expensive or cheap these products are at the time. So we have obviously aggregates such as sand, gravel, any stone, kind of broken down stone, pea shingle, beach pebbles, those kind of things. Aggregates are a huge industry, massive. And obviously they do serve one of the biggest industries in the world, the second largest consumed substance in the world, which is concrete. So the structures that we build most of our structures with across the world is concrete, and it's the second largest consumed substance in the world. First is water. So behind water is concrete. Yay, great. So hence why I want to build with straw bales. Behind that, below that is clay-based products such as bricks and tiles. In the UK, we do have a strong history associated with bricks. We have well-established quarries. We have efficient quarries as well. Somewhere in the region of about 50 quarries and processing plants in the UK are still going to date, and we still get those brick stock through. Interesting enough, there is a brick shortage on at the moment, even though people probably wouldn't know about it. But when you do speak to building merchants reps and various other firms, you realise that there are restrictions on the amount of bricks coming into the industry at the moment, which possibly might be because of the climate that we're in at the moment. I won't mention that word that everybody would be thinking just then, but possibly because of our reserves are drawing down, maybe, I don't know. Timber stock, interesting enough, I don't know if anybody knows how much timber in the UK is actually from UK timber. It's actually used in the construction industry. Any ideas at all? 25%, that's very high. It's closer to 1. So it varies from year to year, but basically about 1% in the UK is actually produced timber from the UK. Interestingly, we have timber that is grown here, sent across to Europe, processed and comes back in various forms to make various products. But the timber market generally in the UK is imported. So a lot of the timber is imported. Hardwoods lead the way in terms of our timber stock, and a lot of those are locally grown, locally sourced, locally produced, and all the rest. Stone and slate, we have had a huge history with using stones and slates. Because of that, our resources are lower, and also because of that, the quality is different, and it's nowhere near as competitively priced as European and further afield stones such as a Bradstone or an Indian sandstone. We can't compete with them price-wise in terms of those materials, so it's very difficult to sell to a client to say, we want to get you a stone which is locally sourced, because there are stone all across the world. There's still stone all across the UK which is appropriate to use for building, but the stone is just so expensive that it just isn't considered in many projects. Lime, on the back of that, obviously we do have a fairly good lime industry in the UK. It's not one of the big hitters, but I wanted to put it in there just to make that kind of evident, really. Plus anything I can bring in and oppose the whole concrete cement argument, I can do. So aspirational sourcing. Natural materials are there. We want to use them as much as possible. We want to put them in their honest form into our structures. But where do we get them from? So this is our model at Hartley Quinn Wilson of how we try and acquire or source materials for projects. The problem with this model is that if you design a structure in an area where there isn't the local materials to suit that structure, then we're basically asking you to redesign your building. So although I put these options often to clients, it doesn't often go any further. I think we've been successful in about 10 cases in the last year where we've actually turned the specification around and the structural design around based on the fact that we're actually encouraging a sustainable project and saying these are the materials we want you to use because they are locally available. So we we aspire to use 40% materials on the project from a 60-mile radius, so a 40-60. And then we have a 70-30, excuse the little O, it's just a bit of a way of getting around it. But we then look at trying to find an additional 30% of materials within a 700-mile radius. Now, 60 miles isn't a lot, especially when you're on the coastline. So we are restricted to some degree to get that 40%. So we really have to push to look for sustainable materials as best we can. 700 miles, that's pretty much the whole of British Isles, that's Ireland, and that's over into Europe as well. So as far across as Frankfurt and beyond Paris, as it were. So a lot of Europe is open to us in that 30%, and that's very easy to achieve. The real target is that 40%, trying to be as local as possible. Now, I'd hope to think there'd be a time when transportation costs and availability of materials maybe change the way that the industry works. At the moment, it doesn't work this way at all. The defining factor over sourcing materials is purely their cost. Now, I'll bring up two projects here. The first one is a recent project I'm doing. We've got some clay tiles going onto a traditional house in the country. The clay tiles match a local brick colour, but the clay tiles that we're using come from Turkey. And the one reason they come from Turkey, well, two reasons. I didn't spec them. Someone else on the project is specifying materials, the roofer. But the one reason really is price. Aesthetically, they look fine. They match what you can get locally, but price-wise, they're about 10% of the price. Now, that's shocking to think that we would get materials across all the way from Turkey to here and use a material which is produced less than 20 miles away in the same form. Same appearance. Put the two tiles up against each other, you can notice some slight differences. Put them up on the wall, maybe just here, you wouldn't notice them at all. Anybody in the audience here wouldn't see any difference between those tiles at all. So despite the aesthetics are the same, the actual material on the whole is the same, the cost is what's driving the sourcing of that material. And so many along the lines, you'll see these barriers that occur to natural materials being used in projects, and that's just one of them. So once we've found a material, we found a location we want to source it from, we also want to look at its credentials as well. So one way of doing that is looking at certification. So either environmental product declarations, responsible procurement strategies of the companies that produce them. We can look through for their guides, their steers really within the industry. So none of these are perfect. None of them work absolutely, but a lot of them will give you an idea of where they're going. Now, some we're probably familiar with, hopefully most. Some you're probably looking at and thinking, I've never seen that before. So obviously timber down in the bottom here, you've got FFC and PEFC, so the Forestry Stewardship Commission, the Programme for Endorsement of Forestry Certification. You've got the NSC, the Natural Stone Council. So I'm working on a project at the moment. Obviously the stone that we're getting is a Bradstone. It would be nice to go for a certified stone, but the cost implications are huge. You're looking at probably somewhere in the region of £200 per square metre as opposed to £40 a square metre, which is over a large area is very expensive. VOC, so zero VOC, so more associated with paints, finishes, glues, coatings, adhesives and mastics as well. Now there's a huge kind of influx of grit fill and various other filling products in the industry at the moment, and a lot of those won't be zero VOC, volatile organic compounds, so they still have strong solvents in them, formaldehyde and various other things. So we want to aim towards those and reduce those as much as we can. Fair trade, guaranteed fair trade, organic. It's interesting to put those in this context. When I kind of introduce these terms generally about a building material, a lot of people will go, well, hold on a second, that's for food and for coffee. What is it to do with anything to do with maybe sheep's wool insulation or maybe to do with a stone that you're getting? Well, the interesting thing behind those concepts is that we're looking for an ethical source to the material that we use. So it's not just about making sure that it's good for the environment and that it's sustainable, it's also that it's good for the local community of where it's produced. So ethical stance on sourcing materials is paramount. People such as the OECD, the Organisation for Economic Cooperation, they have standards where they look at mineral extraction for steel and metals and various other coatings that you would have in the industry. They have standards which you can meet. So you can actually look at where that product is coming from, see if the manufacturer is working with people such as the OECD and agreeing to their terms. They all have procurement methods, due diligence guidance and various other things as well, which can actually help you establish a context to where you're getting your materials from. The UEPG is regarding the aggregates, so it's actually the European Aggregates Association. So aggregates is huge. We use so much of them, making sure that they're not going to be depleted from areas or that they're not going to scar the landscape is quite a big thing. So the UEPG are creating a charter to establish that, and that was started process about 4 years ago and has stalled recently due to economic conditions, unfortunately. You've got the WQA, which is the Water Quality Association. That's to do with the amount of water used in production of materials. So you can actually look at how much water is being used and taken, so fresh water is being used to take that material. So these are all guidance, these are steers to what we can actually source as our materials, the places we want to go, and the kind of accreditation that we want for our materials. There's no right or wrong here, they're all for different fields, but they help inform you as you go through. And that really brings me on, to some degree, onto this, is that looking for materials that are sustainable. I've already alluded to the fact that cost is a big function on that. Aesthetics also has a bearing on whether a material is chosen. So you have to some degree, manage a client's expectations. So if you start from the beginning of a project and they have a budget, and you kind of say, okay, you've got £300,000 to extend your house, and then you turn around to them and say, you can get this kind of footprint for that £300,000. This is how big it would be, your extension. This is the kind of things you would have. But if you were going to be sustainable, if you were going to look at it from a point of a natural material specification, from a point of view of looking at sustainable materials on a whole and a sustainable building methods, as well as how to live in that structure in a sustainable and durable means, then that's going to affect the price. That's going to affect either the price of the project, which is going to go up considerably by about 20% at least, or it's going to restrict the size of which they can do. So if you can manage those expectations at the beginning from a client and introduce that concept, then you're on a winner already. It's a shame really, because the sustainability is always generally brought in at the beginning of a project, and then it seems to be the first thing that seems to be cut out as you go along. Brighton Football Stadium, we're meant to have a green roof, meant to have a whole load of renewable energy sources, didn't get done. The money just wasn't there, and they decided they wanted to do other things with that stadium instead. The aesthetics won, the functionality won instead. And that's the case. Often sustainability will be just cut off, and that will be the scales balanced out. And it's a real shame. So we need to make sure it stays on those scales and doesn't go anywhere else. And it's in the heart of everything we design. So we kind of looked at the broad spectrum of the health benefits for people abroad. We've looked at the health benefits of maybe earlier on today you've looked at the health benefits of living with natural materials. But what about someone building with them? So I am a builder. I've been in the building trade for a long time, as I said. And I don't really want respiratory problems as I get older. I don't really want to have issues with my sight or skin conditions. Using natural materials, on the whole, is better for you. I mean, I can name a few that maybe aren't, such as asbestos, but on the whole, they are. So the health benefits to the person, actually the operative installing, are substantial. The end of life really interests me. How buildings come to an end, and do they end, is a really interesting point that I'm looking into a bit more at the moment, is what you do with a structure at the end of it. So, straw bale building, for example, using natural materials such as wood, straw bale, lime render, lime plaster, keeping the structure very simple, maybe natural slate on the roof, using sheep's wool insulation. Really only the fixings, the windows, and maybe the electrical sockets and wiring are the things that can't be natural. They're those things that you have to compromise with, because that's the only way to do it. You can look at timber framed windows as opposed to a plastic one, so you're already winning. A metal frame window might be better as well, it's definitely better than a plastic one anyway. So there are definite wins in that sense, but it's always a compromise. Taking those elements out of the building, that structure, when it gets to the end of its life, when it's designed that no one wants it anymore, can just collapse and go into biomass. It can just break down and go back into the environment, almost as if it wasn't there. And if you look back historically of our buildings, it wasn't really until the petrochemical revolution that we were able, before that we were doing that. The buildings would just collapse and go back down to the earth, and our footprint technically would disappear. I know it's very different nowadays. We have lots of composite materials and lots of ways of making things, but essentially That is what we want to be looking at. So a building that can just go back to the earth. Embodied energy. Embodied energy on the whole for natural materials is lower, generally across the board for a natural specified material. There are lots of exceptions of that though, which is a real shame. One of which, for example, is concrete. Concrete has a very low embodied energy. Now, if you were going to replace concrete with maybe something as durable or an alternative, so maybe you look at a stone, the embodied energy of that stone is going to be higher. If you look at concrete used in other applications and maybe compared it with a steel frame instead of a concrete frame, that steel is going to have a higher embodied energy as well. So it's very difficult to actually see, in terms of embodied energy, whether we're saving anything or not. But it's certainly something that we should consider on a product. Embodied energy ratings and figures given by manufacturers have to be really been taken with a pinch of salt. They're not always accurate, and they are generally produced to encourage a product to be used. So we have to kind of be open-minded about when we're looking at embodied energy figures. Investment in traditional crafts. So I don't know if you saw some of the lime plastering going on outside during the breaks, but there is definitely a drop in traditional crafts in the UK with some of these natural materials. Lime plaster on the whole is becoming a bit of a premium item because people just don't do it as much. Watland daub, cob building, all these very traditional building methods are becoming niche and expensive and premium, purely because people are just not engaging with them enough. If we can engage with them by using a natural material, then we can sustain these for future generations and they won't die out. You know, I hear quite often about a traditional craft dying out. Every 5 years or so, there'll be a message on the building forums or something, or an article in the newspaper saying this will be the last person who knows this craft. You know, traditional Welsh thatching almost died I think about 5 years ago, and they took on a new apprentice, and basically the person that was doing it was so old, physically just couldn't carry on. The craft there was losing out, and it would have been replaced with something else instead, something easy and convenient to use as a roofing method, which is one of the big barriers is convenience, cost and convenience. It's easy just to go down to a builder's merchant and just go, that one. Or to go to a conference of building materials as an architect and say, okay, this is material, is well tested, we know it works, we'll go with that one, despite its environmental footprint. It's very easy to ignore those things. Durability-wise, materials tend to last longer as a natural material, but that's a sweeping statement. We are putting more and more emphasis on natural materials lasting longer, and as such we're using coatings and various other things to keep materials for staying, natural materials to stay and to last for longer in a building. So for example, cladding, timber cladding on a structure was always originally designed as a sacrificial layer to the building, to protect it, to let the weather go on that, and then that would be renewed. Now, nowadays, we want timber cladding, which is expensive, to last longer. So we coat it. We coat it with lots and lots of chemical-based products. And they may be natural VOC or zero VOC paints. They might be natural solvents, natural varnishes. But at the end of the day, we're coating that product to keep them there, to allow them to be used for longer. Whereas before in the past, it would be a case of stripping that off and replacing it. So using these synthetic coatings is elongating their durability, but at what cost? Which is where we kind of come to the hallway here, where we're talking, actually, what is this material? Is it natural or not? Living with natural materials. So as I get to this point at the presentation, I'm reminded of when I walked into a beautiful cob structure in Bristol. It's a beautiful roundhouse cob building with round solid timbers. The windows were reclaimed from an old building. The floor was an earthen floor. The heating system was a small stove in the corner. The experience of walking into that room is substantially different to walking into our modern ultra-finished, square-edged, flush designed homes that we live in today. Now, I'm not suggesting that is suitable for everybody, but what I'm saying is there is things that we can learn from that space and incorporate into our modern design. Cob buildings can be clean and crisp. They can be modern. They don't have to be Yoda's cave. They can be whatever you want them to be. Strawbale buildings, some of the strawbale buildings out there, you couldn't tell they're a strawbale structure at all. The way they're clad, the way they're finished, you'll just think it's a standard building. So there's definitely opportunities there to incorporate the ideas, incorporate the design concepts, the thoughts and the philosophy from through true eco-hippie building into our construction area. And that's really the goal, really, overall, is to try and get our current construction industry or community to incorporate those as much as possible. There are obviously benefits such as breathability and durability, the physical and mental health, which hopefully has been spoken about this morning already. There's loads. There's absolutely loads of reasons why, and it's kind of mad that we're not doing this. As I said, about 15 years ago, I spoke to the Welsh Assembly Government about this. We had a big talk, and I said, you know, sustainability is a grey area, sustainable materials, it's really hard to put a pin on what it is. Together we'll find a way forward. Well, it's been 15 years. We already have the answers in front of us. We have natural insulation. We have good products which have been tested already. We've got a market which is brimming, ready to be used in a big way, but we just need the uptake. We need people to see it for what it is. When you buy clothes, when you buy a car, when you buy a house, the things that you're buying, they've been made somewhere. Some of the materials that we have in our homes are being made in places where people are suffering. We don't want that. We have a responsibility as end users and living with these homes to be responsible about where it comes from. So that's my message really for today, is to think about carefully where your materials come from, across the board, whether it's in your house or whether it's the clothes you buy. Think about them carefully and choose them carefully. Thank you.